I would like to thank everybody for making it here today for our presentations. I thank my colleagues, Marina and Natalia, for their thorough research and outstanding presentations. And today we're going to talk about enclaves, an issue which is personally important to me, the border demarcation, borders, general concepts of Central Asian integration. As Natalia and I ourselves are a little reflection of Central Asian integration. She's my wife, I'm a citizen of Uzbekistan, she's a citizen of Kyrgyzstan. So the name of my presentation is Do Good Fences, Make Good Neighbors, as a reference to Robert Frost's poem, The Mending Wall. And as you can see already from the first slide, there are so many enclaves in the Ferghana Valley, and the lines are so odd and so intertwined. And some scholars explain this as Stalin's idea behind dividing and conquering Central Asia, while others argue that the very integration between the upstream water-rich countries and the downstream fossil fuel-rich countries, the very idea was to actually integration. And they thought that they never could foresee that sometimes these would become independent nation states, and thought that with time, in fact, the ethnic sort of differences would wither away. Why study enclaves? There are 282 enclaves on the world political map, which are home to over 2 million people. In the Ferghana Valley, there are 8 enclaves and are home to 100,000 people. Enclaves cover a wide range of problems, from movement of people to trade, access to water, education, access to resources. This here is there is a large set of enclaves between Bangladesh and India. It's referred to as Kuch Bihar. The gentleman here is standing in a counter enclave. But today we are not going to go into the various types of enclaves, but this is a very interesting phenomenon. Basically, an enclave inside of an enclave inside of an enclave. You make a step forward, you're in another country, 10 meters down the road, you are back home. The issue, in sections of the borderline between Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, if you were actually to install a border, it would go through somebody's household, and half of the family would wake up in Kyrgyzstan, for example, and another half in Uzbekistan, which makes the problem of border demarcation, makes the process of border demarcation very problematic. For this very reason, 30% of the borderline remains disputed. This is the town of Karasu, and half of it is located in Uzbekistan, half of it in Kyrgyzstan, and even the very name has its phonetic difference. 8 enclaves of the Ferghana Valley. Here you see the ones that appear on the news the most, and they're also the largest by size. Tajik enclave in Kyrgyzstan, Baruch. Uzbek enclave in Kyrgyzstan, Soch. Uzbek enclave, Shakhivardan. Small enclave to the north of Soch, Kalacha. What's interesting about Soch is that it's a territory of Uzbekistan, completely surrounded by Kyrgyzstan, but populated by ethnic Tajiks. And again, when you go back to the history of enclave and their emergence, some people say that, well, the way it worked was because, for instance, in Baruch, lots of people were ethnic Tajiks, that's why the territory was given to the Tajiks SSR. While in Barak, a tiny Kyrgyz enclave in Uzbekistan, people spoke Kyrgyz, so the land unit was given to the Uzbek SSR, despite the fact that it's not connected to mainland Kyrgyz SSR. In Baruch, there are ethnic Tajiks who constitute 99% of the population. This can be explained by the fact that Tajikistan itself was an autonomous republic inside of Uzbek SSR back when these nation states were being crafted out, or the Soviet states were crafted out. And again, today we see how these processes echo, because when the governments get together to decide on the legal status of the enclaves, each country sort of refers to different documents dating from the 1920s, 1930s, and 1950s, whatever documents favor them. This is a small enclave of Kyrgyzstan in Uzbekistan, Barak, not Obama. It was once home to 1,500 people, but the population has been declining. And this is an example of the relationship that both the surrounding country and the mother state can have with their enclave. There is a positive and negative stimulus. Basically, you can maintain ties with your mother country, or you can become closer with the surrounding state, or you can completely lose your relationship with the mother country and be isolated from the surrounding state, and life inside of the enclave would be very tough, as we see in the example of Kyrgyzstan's Barak enclave, where the residents have long demanded their relocation to mainland Kyrgyzstan and have succeeded recently. Recent reports claim that only 29 families are residing in the enclave and are also demanding to be relocated. Sarawak or Sarawak is another example of positive stimulus. This is the Tajik enclave inside of Uzbekistan, and the residents have been sort of absorbed by Uzbekistan. There is a relationship that they have, and they can trade-wise, like they grow cotton and sell it to the government of Uzbekistan. Some reports also claim that people there, half of the residents received Uzbek citizenship and are now being integrated into the Uzbek state more so. But going back to the issue of the history of enclaves and their legal status, this is an image from the Soviet encyclopedia. It shows the map of Central Asia from the 1930s. As you can see, neither Varukh nor Soch are enclaves here. And this is again those types of documents that countries refer to when they discuss the status of the enclaves. These vague definitions, vague sources and differences in documents cause huge problems today, both for the process of border demarcation and for the residents of enclaves and neo-border territories. Because even insignificant and unpopulated enclaves, this here is West Kalacha, it's a Tajik enclave in Kyrgyzstan, it's as small as 1 square kilometer, it is unpopulated, uninhabited, yet you see it's located right on the road, on a strategic road. This very location causes sparks of tension and violence. Enclaves are hard to govern. I mean, you have a territory of another state in the middle of your province, like in the case of Batken, or contrary, you have a whole territory that you need to maintain relationships with while it is not connected to your mainland and is also populated by ethnic minorities, like in the case of Soch. This image here, I wanted to illustrate how people who lived for decades next to each other and traded and had interaction are suddenly now divided by a trench. So installing these borders, defining the borders is essential for nation building, for the construction of new states, but it also has its own implications on residents of enclaves and residents of neo-border areas. And this is explained in theory. The theory behind enclaves is introduced by Evgeny Vinokurov, and he offers a triadic relationship between the enclave, the mother state, and the surrounding country. And this is a dynamic. Basically, the relationships between the surrounding state and the mother state, of course, have an effect on the life of the enclave. Vice versa, the very enclave may have an effect on the relationships between the mainland state and the surrounding state. In the Central Asia case, I had to turn the triangular relationships into a trapezoid because there is a fourth player that comes into the game, and this is the ethnic root state of the enclave. So now we have Soch being the enclave, Uzbekistan is the mother state, Kyrgyzstan is the surrounding state, and Tajikistan is an ethnic root state. 4 countries are involved in the fate of this territory, and which makes things even more complicated. During my field research, when I interviewed people, I was very curious to hear their identity. And I asked the residents, well, how do you identify yourself being an ethnic Tajik living in Uzbekistan surrounded by Kyrgyzstan? And I really heard two identities that they told me. They felt like they're Uzbek citizens, but they're ethnic Tajiks. And their relatives live in Uzbekistan, but they're ethnic Tajiks. And when I asked them about the solution, how do you see the solution of the enclaves? They all wanted a corridor to mainland Uzbekistan so they can access their relatives, visit funerals, attend weddings, which at the moment is difficult for them to travel to mainland Uzbekistan because they have to go around, which adds another 150 kilometers to their route, which would otherwise take 5 kilometers. Border security has been the priority for Central Asian states. After the explosions in 1999 in Tashkent, Uzbekistan took very proactive measures in defining and demarcating and installing its boundaries. Of course, proximity to Afghanistan has not only made this a local, sort of regional issue, but also a global issue. The global war on terrorism played a role. Central Asia was of huge interest to the West. And with this in mind, we see two paradoxes. On the one hand, the Central Asian borderlines became highly securitized. So we need to secure our borders so we protect ourselves from something that could potentially threaten our security. On the other hand, the border remains porous. The borderline between Tajikistan and Afghanistan is rather porous, so is the borderline between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and this is of concern for the government of Uzbekistan. when it comes to the news reports, we often hear that these are ethnic clashes, ethnic sort of outbursts of tension. And I would like to say here that ethnicity is a surface notion. What lies on the ground are the real everyday problems that people living in the enclaves and in near border areas face. Access to resources, access to water, land, trade, economic well-being, sanitation, access to education, healthcare, and the relationship with the mainland state or the mother state. Because if this relationship is not maintained well, people take individual action in solving their everyday problems, and this often comes out in an aggressive manner, and with time gains an element of ethnic dispute to it. It's sort of an analogy of a tsunami. You have an earthquake in the bottom of the ocean, which then splashes out into something grand that you cannot stop anymore. And the unfortunate example of this are the Osh events of 2010. It is alarming how, while the root problem is not ethnicity, it's alarming how quickly the ethnic component comes into the picture when it comes to disputes over resources. So the question of my research is, do good fences make good neighbors? And the answer that I propose is, in fact, that good neighbors make good fences. The more trust there is between the neighbors, the more these links are maintained, the safer it is for the region as a whole, and for the stability of the region. Some of the recommendations I'd like to make. First of all, to conclude, the enclaves cover a vast variety of concepts, so ask me questions when you have the opportunity, please. But I would like to just sort of jump ahead to the solutions. And some propose the corridor solution to connect Soch with mainland Uzbekistan, which is actually impossible, because if you do connect Soch with mainland Uzbekistan, the Batken province would become an enclave itself. As to the south of the enclave, there are Alai mountains that are hard to travel through via vehicles, and it's hard to build a road there. But generally, enclaves need to be recognized, their legal status is an enclave. So you have an enclave, right? And it needs to be recognized by all states that this territory belongs to this or that country and is surrounded by ours. Mutually beneficial roads and infrastructure must be installed in the near border areas, including the border crossing points. At the moment, out of 3 border crossing points between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, only 1 is functioning on an everyday basis, making it difficult for people to travel for whatever needs they may have. And promoting legal movement of goods and people by installing and operating more posts on the borderline would ease their everyday life and demands, and would actually decrease the amount of tension outbursts that we see in the near border areas. Making the process of border demarcation transparent is also essential, as this is something that should not be secretive, so that the people on the ground don't feel like they have nobody to look at and no hopes to gain any support from the surrounding state or the mother state or the region in general, and need to take individual actions. And involving local residents, leaders, informal leaders, and self-government authorities is also crucial, as they face these problems, they live these problems, and they can find a better solution than somebody who doesn't live this every day. I thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
State Department, I'm an analyst on Tajikistan and Uzbekistan there. Just want to throw out a disclaimer that my comments are my own personal ones, do not represent those of the State Department or the U.S. government. So I'm really happy to have met in the last few months Rashid, and to have someone with such extensive fieldwork experience working on this topic. There's just a handful of scholars, to name a few, Madeline Reeves, Nick Megaran, Alex Diener, who have all worked on these topics up close, on the ground. And it's very important because there are so many narratives about the Ferghana Valley that we see regurgitated, reproduced in popular press and in scholarship and policy circles that are based on understudied, misanalyzed, overinterpreted topics, and they tend to boil down the problems to ethnic differences and resource struggles. Those are factors that are involved, as Rashid points out. but actually looking at how these issues play out is something that is very important in order to understand what's going on. So I want to just make a few points about your presentation and then make some, raise a number of questions about what we can look at to examine these. And before I do that, I just wanted to make a few points about why there is growing interest in this issue of enclaves in the policy world, certainly. And some of this has to do with the comments, the statements that officials make about what's going on in the region, what's going to happen in Afghanistan, which is not so far away, the ability of the border countries bordering Afghanistan and nearby in the region to be able to defend their borders, and what they need to be able to do that. And there's not a lot of consensus about what actually needs to be done. One of the things that makes this also an important topic is that there's been an intensification of conflicts and tensions around these enclaves in the last couple of years. Not that they didn't exist prior to that, but that in addition to other conflicts, intra-regional conflicts, raises the question of the confidence and the capacity or ability of local governments to contain these conflicts. And we've actually seen in the last few months an increased level of cooperation among the local governments, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. Does that mean that they're going to resolve all these issues, some of which they have not been willing to touch since independence, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, especially border delimitations? As I said, all of these need to be contextualized more in terms of concrete policy decisions and actions made with talking about the material consequences. Rashid argues that good neighbors make good fences, and this is entirely true. I couldn't agree more. And the neighbors in this region historically and recently have not been good to one another. And relations are often built on suspicion and mistrust. This is that despite efforts to temper, for example, nationalist sentiment in Central Asia by the governments, the cross-border dynamics have tended in many ways to produce it and reinforce it, certainly in the cross-border context and around these enclaves, for example, as people feel frustrated that they're no longer able to send their herds to graze. The flexibility that they once felt in crossing these borders is increasingly reduced through securitization policies and implementation. One area, I think, for elaboration, and I wanted to focus on your policy recommendations, and it's always difficult to make policy recommendations because there are always sort of a whole almost infinite constellation of questions about one, who are they aimed at, of course, but also, and you made that clear. But what is the range of interests and what are the agendas of all the actors who have a stake, and sort of enumerating what and identifying what all of those different actors are and what their stakes are is very important. You mentioned involving local community leaders who have greater knowledge of community needs. That's a very sensible recommendation. People who understand the dynamics, the histories of local tensions and conflicts, versus those of the politicians in far-off capitals, Bishkek, Dushanbe, Tashkent. But what would real transparency look like? what are we asking for? We need to understand the range of interests and agendas of all players who are involved in these issues, from officials in the capitals and provincial cities to security services, border guards, to business interests, and all local players. Why do national leaders invoke concerns about external forces intervening in these tensions and in these conflicts, or having an interest in intervening, whether it's Russia, whether it's international NGOs, whether it's other forces, other governments? Why are there narratives of destabilizing, efforts to destabilize this using enclaves as a sort of access point? Is everyone equally interested in reducing tensions? Which of these tensions are more, have a higher priority or less priority? To what extent are national leaders interested in fixing unambiguous borders? We've seen that flexibility on the one hand allows people to get their business done on a daily basis. And yet, on the other hand, there's the priority of security, not to mention corruption by border guards or anybody else in positions of authority along these areas. What is the range of local concerns and resolutions? And how practical are solutions that entail flexibility, whether it's in documentation, visas, restrictions on who can travel and when, in cross-border activity and movement? So there are a lot of questions about actors and agendas, and some of these are very hard to get at, because on the one hand we have public statements that do not necessarily reflect some of the real interests that policymakers are taking into account in trying to balance in these regions. And then finally, what are the broader geopolitical factors that are influencing these tensions at any given point in time? But especially local government positions on these tensions and conflicts. And how seriously are we to take these versus the very local actions that are activities that are going on. So let me stop there and give you a chance to respond and take questions.
Rashid, would you like to respond before we open
Sure.
the floor?
Thank you, David, for your comments. The issue is indeed very difficult to tackle, to approach, and that is why it was very hard to make recommendations. I didn't want to make very vague or improbable policy recommendations, such as, you can apply some of the European practices, but by no means are Central Asian states at that point of plausible integration of any kind. Bringing in the various actors into the picture is also very important, and here social sciences, we often don't look at the underground trade, and we don't look at the shadow economy, and we don't look at the organized crime factor as well. And I think these are very important in studying the enclaves and borders in general, movement that goes through these lucid sort of borderlines. Unfortunately, this is impossible to research in television. It's very difficult, and if you want to live and raise kids, you don't want to be involved in it. Actors are also very important to identify, and I think all states want a solution. They have long been willing to find a solution, or at least they say that there needs to be a solution done. Another question is, what are the actions that are being taken for it? How systematic are the negotiations? And I think one of the best things, if you look at the history of border demarcation, the 1,000 kilometers were demarcated when there was sort of a constant meetings, when there were constant negotiations. And once they froze, of course they stopped at the toughest borderlines. The process also froze with them, obviously. That's why questions are numerous. When it comes to the role of the people themselves, actually with the Barak enclave, some Kyrgyz authorities claim that they have the opportunity to move to mainland Kyrgyzstan, but it's just favorable for them to live in the enclave because they can conduct illegal trade, and that they actually themselves want to live like this. To which the enclave residents answer that this is ultimately not true, and this is just one way that how the government makes enemies out of us, instead of making us victims, and so on. So further debates on where is the truth in this can be discussed. Broader geopolitical factors, local actors, and priorities are crucial, essential, but for all Central Asian states, border demarcation, border security has been the priority. So outlining baby steps, outlining the actions that can be mutually performed, I guess, as a region that's essentially important, because international organizations, the OEC, tried to be the platform, but they failed. So I would claim that ultimately this is up to the states themselves, up to the Central Asian states themselves.
Thank you, Rashid. Let's collect some questions.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation, Rashid. I was not familiar with the enclave problem in Central Asia until just now. It reminded me of, but your solution kind of reminded me of times when the Western European state system was in flux very early on, when there were multiple layers of authority. And I wondered if you had considered looking at how that evolved or resolved itself as a way to reconceptualize the problem of enclaves. It seemed to me that the notion of border security has made this problem more difficult than more simple to resolve.
Let's collect several questions.
Thank you, Rashid and Chantal. You were great. I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit why it is important that we study enclaves, what importance it has for our understanding of international affairs these days. And is there a relation between the reason the enclave was established and the type of problems it is experiencing?
Thank you. Rashid was a very interesting subject to talk about. I think it's very complicated as well, so I think you really had to be very careful about how to put things in, because it's so security as well. But my question may sound very complicated because I'd like to understand what's your opinion, your own opinion as an expert, as how good the mother states protect the enclaves that belong to them. Like how good they protect the interests of citizens who live there, for example, the commercial interests, the trade possibilities, and for example, concerning the Soh, which you describe as being an Uzbek enclave surrounded by Kyrgyzstan, where ethnic Tajiks live. For example, Uzbeks and Tajiks are not in good relations right now due to different various issues, water resources being one of them, for example. So how Uzbek government would be really interested in protecting, for example, let's say, theoretically, Tajik ethnicities there, if, for example, they're going to be fired by the neighboring Kyrgyzstan, if some trouble going to happen there. For example, that scenario happens, will the Uzbek government try to protect them? Thank you very much.
Two more questions.
Sébastien Bérou, Central Asia Program. Rashid, thank you so much. I mean, your paper is really great. I just wondering, is it possible to make actually some good fences, even if neighboring countries have very good relations? I mean, as long as people's standard of living will be so low, as long as border guards will be so corrupted. And here, I mean, I specify, I don't put the blame on border guards. I mean, they have so low salaries that they have to live. But this is really one of the main reasons of tensions between people living in the border areas. And we have seen actually that in some regions there were even more tensions once the border had been demarcated because of that. So the main issue, one of the main issues actually would be not necessarily the relations between bordering countries, but more the domestic situation, some government's predation policy, which so strongly limits investments in all in what makes the daily life, the human security of a Central Asia population, like creating jobs or like training border guards to build trustful relations between these border guards and the population. I would be happy to have your opinion about that. Thank you.
And last question.
My question is specifically about Soch, Rashid. I know you and we have talked about this before. From what we know, it is the largest enclave in the world, right?
Largest true enclave out of all the
Okay,
various
yeah.
enclaves.
And how did it have come to be? Was it created as the documents say in early 90s? What was it? We know that it's a part of the Ferghana region, but how is it managed? How is it run? Who is in charge in Soch?
All right, thank you all. Very, very good questions. To make it more logical, I'll start with Chantal's question about why are the enclaves important. To begin with, why do we want to study enclaves? Well, they are a unique phenomenon, and there were several phases of their appearance on the world political map, and some of them go back to the feudal wars. You know, you conquer a village, and then with time it becomes the territory of another country. Some enclaves are made voluntarily, like the Vatican is an enclave state, and they wanted to be an enclave state. Then you have Alaska is an enclave, you know. So for that aside, except for the fact that there are all these different kinds of enclaves, and they're part of international relations, and therefore they deserve attention. They're also home to people. They're somebody's reality, everyday life, and if you want to go, they offer a large platform for exploration of international relations between the state and the enclave and the effects of relationship with one state on relationship with another, and all that. They specifically in Central Asia, in the Ferghana Valley, they're often referred to as sort of these barrels filled with gunpowder that at some point might explode. And while I think that is a bit exaggerated, yet they deserve much attention from all the governments, because again, this is the Ferghana Valley. It's the most densely populated region in Central Asia. It's very significant economically, agriculturally, and if you have problems in that region, then you have probably in the whole region. Border security, Lori, and practices of Western Europe. I think this is a mutual problem for all states, and if they want to gain some kind of solution, it has to be done on a multilateral level, so that there are no sort of suspicions of each other, and this is what I also mean by transparency. You know, and whatever is done in a unilateral manner always has a reaction. You know, somebody builds a road where the territory is disputed, the other side responds with mining that road, or using hard weapons against you. And this is obviously nothing good for the region. Protection of citizens, residents, Juldus, and this really depends on the enclave, on the host state, on the surrounding state. So you cannot just make a sort of, you cannot speak for all the enclaves, but I'll give you some examples. Like despite the fact that the citizens of Soch are ethnic Tajiks, it is, and part of this answer will answer your question of Ahor as well. Uzbekistan maintains relationship with Soch. In the 90s, it really quickly issued passports to the citizens, to the residents of Soch. There are schools, there are colleges, so there is education, some form of administration, because it is under the administration of the Ferghana Oblast. Therefore, they have this connection, they have this relationship with the mainland state, whereas in case of Barak, for example, or in case of Sarwan, these relationships have been lost. Sebastian, about the fences and investments. Obviously, the enclaves are sort of a reflection of what's going on a greater scale of things generally. All these relationships between the Central Asian states, all the domestic issues are just reflected in this one enclave, one territory. What is the status of minorities? How do people get access to water? How do they divide the land? Does ethnicity matter in the land and water division? How does the herding population live versus the settled agricultural population of your country? And that's why, yet again, the legal status of the enclaves is very important to define here. The countries have to come to agreement. For example, look at Shahimardan enclave. It is defined. Everybody agrees that this is an enclave. And therefore, the people don't face, their land is not jeopardized, the people who reside there. Another question is that, okay, Shahimardan has historically been sort of a resort place. How easily can people travel to Shahimardan? Are you going to plan your next vacation to Shahimardan, and go to the enclave through 3 countries? So these sort of economic realities are also at stake and need to be discussed as well by access to people. And in Western Europe, these enclaves between Belgium and the Netherlands, they have become nowadays a mere tourist attraction. For instance, you are sitting in a restaurant and here's Belgium, here's Netherlands. I don't know if this at one point will be a reality for Central Asia, but certainly would be nice.